All right. Thank you for joining me on this episode of The Gospel Truth. I'm your host, Marlon Wilson, and we have another great one for you today. We're going to talk about a little philosophy, idealism versus physicalism, and I got Kyle Alander with me and Thomas Christiansen, and we're going to get a debate going about this subject matter. This is a new one on The Gospel Truth, and both of these guys are newcomers to The Gospel Truth, man. As you know, I always like to see newcomers jump on here and jump into the Gospel Truth octagon, you know what I mean? Get this battle going a little bit. But with that said, I want to go ahead and encourage you to like and follow The Gospel Truth. Make sure you're hitting that like, make sure you're hitting that subscribe and that notification bell so you can stay in the loop with what The Gospel Truth has going on. Don't miss out on any live show because I am planning debates and I'm planning interviews as we speak, man. I got a whole bunch of folks that want to come on. I got a whole bunch of folks that's come on and give us the rundown and the lowdown of what their expertise is. So we're going to get that going. Also, if you don't know, all this Gospel Truth content is on podcast. So the content is on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, Spotify. Make sure you're flowing over there to go ahead and give a good rating, good subscribe. Hook me up, man. Let's get this podcast popular so we can engage the culture of Christian truth through audio. Right? Get that going. Also, if you're not aware, The Gospel Truth is also on Instagram and Twitter. So if you can, go ahead and flow over there and subscribe there as well. You know what I mean? Just go ahead and hook a brother up there as well to get this overall platform of The Gospel Truth popular. Because as you know, The Gospel Truth is engaging the culture of Christian truth, and we do that through debates, interviews, and Bible lessons. And I need your help to spread that gospel, to get the Gospel Truth out there so the Gospel Truth can get out to the masses, right? Let's make sure we're helping a brother out in that, at least that, man. You know what I'm saying? So with that said, I'm gonna go over a couple announcements, then I'm gonna bring my interlocutors in. Coming up January 7th, I have Is God Triune According to the Bible? That's gonna be Otis Lewis versus Chris Cada Williams. So we're gonna get that going on at January 7th at 5 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. After that, or I think I start to slide backwards, so this is before that, December 30th, I have Is a Concept of Biological Evolution Inherently Racist? That's coming up, Robert Rowe versus William. Both of these guys have been on the show before, and they both performed very well, so this is going to be an exciting and great debate, so look out for that one. After that, I have a lesson coming up, or a show coming up on my Let's Talk segment of The Gospel Truth. It's called What is Pelagianism? All right, so we're going to talk about a little Pelagius, what it's about, Pelagianism, what it's about, what it's teaching, and how do Christians stay away from this heresy, because it is a heresy. So let's we're going to get that going. So make sure you tune in December 31st at 4:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 1:30 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. And then lastly, I have coming up January 5th, I have Matt Slick jumping back on here, and he's going to debate A.K. Richardson. How should we interpret Romans chapter 9? That's coming up soon, so make sure you guys are staying in the loop with what the Gospel Truth has going on. Once again, if you are planning on leaving this show early, hit that subscribe, hit that like, stay in the loop. Don't leave this channel without subscribing to the Gospel Truth. Please just do that. All right, that said, I'm going to bring in my guys. They're going to come in and give you a great debate. I expect great performance out of these guys. I'm excited. Man, philosophy is not my cup of tea, so they go school me on a little bit of this stuff, and I may have some just fundamental philosophy one-on-one type questions when we talk about idealism, physicalism. I may have some very, very basic questions for these guys, but I'm going to try to battle for these guys, though. You know what I'm saying? So we're going to get it going. Let me bring these guys in. What is up, fellas? What's going on? What's going on? How y'all doing?
We're good.
Oh, good.
I'm good.
Yeah. Good to go. Hey, Thomas, do me a favor. Squeeze into that frame a little bit. You're a little off center there. There you go. So people can see you, man. All right, guys. Thank you for joining me in this episode of Gospel Truth. I appreciate you. Before we get into this debate, I'm going to give you a chance to introduce yourself to the audience. Tell folks about what you do. If you have a blog, tell them about it. If you have a social media platform, tell them about it so they can check you out, see your content, and everything you're doing, all right? That said, Kyle, man, go give a quick introduction to yourself, man.
All right, my name is Kyle Alander. I run the Christian Idealism YouTube channel, and I do videos on this very topic, which is philosophy of mind. And hopefully this debate can kind of sort of outline some of the reasons why I'm an idealist as well as why others should consider it. So other than that, I also do philosophy of religion, but mainly philosophy of mind. But yeah, again, Christian Idealism, go check it out. Pretty good content, I think. So.
All right, Thomas, go ahead and give a quick introduction to yourself, man.
Okay, I am Thomas Christiansen. I run a YouTube channel called Man-Centered Pelagian. So please give that YouTube channel a look if you have the chance. I make all sorts of content on all sorts of different topics. I cover religious topics, and sometimes I'll cover non-religious topics as well. My theology is pretty unconventional, like most people would not hold to it, which I fully accept that fact. And I would disagree with my opponent in that I believe reality is real, and I believe reality is physical. And I believe existence is a discrete physical object with a location.
All right, all right. Thank you both for joining me today. And we're going to jump into this debate. Once again, debate is the nature, reality, idealism, or physicalism. And we're going to start off with 10-minute opening statements, followed by a 5-minute rebuttal. We're going to follow that with a 50-minute cross-examination. The first 30 minutes will be 15 minutes each to ask questions. Then the final 20 minutes will be more of an open discussion. Then we have 5 minutes in closing and then Q&A from the audience. You got it? All right, all right. Once again, you will hear this chime whenever you get to that 1 minute mark in your opening statements and your rebuttal rounds. You will hear that chime. All right. So that said, Kyle, I believe you are to go first. So,
all right.
Go ahead and share your screen, and then I will start your time.
All right. Can you guys see that?
Yep. We all can
all
see
right.
it.
Let's get started. All right. This is a brief case for idealism. This is going to be my opening statement for this debate. So before we get into idealism, we first need to understand what consciousness actually is. So consciousness is mental activity in and of itself. Mental activity is conscious if and only if there is anything it is like to have such mental activity in and of itself. Another definition we could put forth would be this. Mental activity is conscious if there's something it feels like to have such mental activity in and of itself. The words to feel, however, is not clear enough to be used as a solid definition. So philosophers of mind typically define consciousness as anything it is like to have such mental activity in and of itself. In fact, if you take a second to think about your own experience, you cannot contain it in one thought because you are currently experiencing what it is like to experience, or another word to put it is that you're currently conscious of what it is like to be conscious. We can directly know that we are conscious, and we can directly know that we have experience. However, in order to have direct knowledge of experience, we must be experiencing our experiences. And so experience or consciousness would extend beyond what we can directly know. So consciousness is not to be confused with a self-aware mind. However, consciousness is ontologically mental, as all mental activity is conscious, even if there is no self-reflection. So basically, on idealism, the fundamental nature, reality is consciousness or experience. Experience is ontologically mental in type, and matter is comprised of phenomenal states or contents of consciousness, and so matter is also mental in type. First sort of thing we should sort of understand is foundationalist epistemology. All knowledge, which is our true beliefs, are like a building block, as each belief is justified by other beliefs until you reach a properly basic belief, which itself is known for absolute certainty. We reach these by doubting all that can be logically doubted and then accepting what cannot be logically doubted as foundational. These include the Cartesian ego, the mind, the ideas in our mind, our thoughts and our doubts, as well as primary sensory data. The Cartesian ego is a mind, ideas are things contained within the mind, and the mind is a primary sensory data is first-person mental impressions. The material world is on the other side of this perception, however, and is thus not properly basic. Since external world skepticism is logically possible, then anything with material ontology cannot be used as first principles. Therefore, first principles only refer to objects with mental ontology, as that is all one is able to refer to prior to solving the problem of external world skepticism. So here's the first argument, and this is an epistemic argument. Premise 1, the terms in first principles only refer to objects with mental ontology. Premise 2, the terms in all conclusions about everything containing true knowledge must be found in first principles. In conclusion, therefore, everything knowable must have mental ontology, or all knowledge is dependent on experiences. So the implication of this, of course, is that we cannot have any justification for any world that is outside experience, even in principle. So that's the first argument I want to put forth. The second argument is what I call the causal closure argument. Now, it's kind of weird because according to standard encyclopedia of philosophy, the argument from causal closure is perhaps the dominant argument for physicalism in the literature today. However, a parallel argument can be used to support idealism. Premise 1, the causal closure of the universe. Every event which has a cause from an effect that is the same in type, meaning events that interact must have the same substance and properties. So I'm not going to really defend this premise much because I think it's supported by physics, and I think physicalists, I think my opponent would actually probably agree at least with this premise, which is the causal closure. So premise 2, the irreducibility of consciousness. The mental is subjective and qualitative in type and cannot be reduced to or identified as an objective and quantitative phenomena. The mental has its own substantive properties. So I've this sort of premise right here is supported by a further argument. Premise 1, if consciousness is reducible to material phenomena, then identifying material phenomena identifies what it is like to be the subject for the subject. Premise 2, identifying material phenomena does not identify what it is like to be the subject for the subject. Conclusion, consciousness is not reducible to material phenomena, or consciousness is irreducible. So that's premise 2. Premise 3, mental events cause physical events. For example, we normally think of events such as wanting to raise your arm, and mental events can cause an event such as the raising of your arm. So I would argue that mental causation is a real phenomenon in nature, and that evolution shows that our mental lives can be changed through time and have real effects in the world. So I have a short argument to defend this, which is basically premise 1, phenomenal properties evolved. Premise 2, on-epi phenomenalism, phenomenal properties are useless. Premise 3, useless features don't evolved, therefore epiphenomenalism is false. So the conclusion of this basic argument on the left here is that physical events are mental in type, or more briefly, that idealism is true. For of course, if the thesis of causal closure is true, and the mental is irreducible and causes physical events, then the physical itself must be mental in type. So the universe and everything that can be interacted with is mental. So that's the second, I would say, argument for idealism. Then finally, I want to compare idealism and physicalism with theoretic virtues. So just briefly, we have simplicity. We want a simple theory. We want a theory that has the least amount of unnecessary assumptions, and we want a theory that has good explanatory power. I mean, it doesn't have any like explanatory gaps, and it also has like less bruteness and stuff like that. So when we compare the two views, when we compare physicalism and idealism, it turns out idealism is simpler. So on physicalism, all that exists is space, time, some properties, and sets. And all the other objects that make up the observed universe are minded organisms, sculptures, etc. That gives us 3 kinds of basic entities. And so physicalism has to add the abstraction of a world that's independent of experience. However, on idealism, there's only one kind of basic entity, which is an experiencing mind or some experiencing minds. And so given the existence of experiencing minds, the idealist can account for all the varied structures of reality. So that's based on simplicity. Just to give you a little quote by Bernard Kastrup, the defining characteristics of explanation by abstraction is a progressive movement away from Edmund Husserl's life world from the concreteness of direct experience. First, one posits a world devoid of qualities, and as such devoid of concreteness too, for concreteness is a quality of experience. Then one progressively loads this world with properties that entail no direct isomorphism to experience. So that's that quote. And then finally, we want to compare, of course, explanatory power. So I would say physicalism can explain neuroscience, and I think it could also explain how the brain could function, but it cannot explain the existence of our experience or why functions in the brain should even have experiences. And this is, of course, due to the hard problem of consciousness. So it's having to actually reduce consciousness to consciousness's own abstraction. And so physicalism would have more explanatory gaps. On idealism, you have consciousness can explain all reality. It leaves very little unexplained. And of course, the relationship between absolute mind and our minds is a work in progress. And most importantly, idealism can explain everything that physicalism does, but with less logic conceptual problems and more simplicity in the fundamental ontology. So matter, I would say, is an abstraction of mind, which means that the existence of matter, or any world outside consciousness, is not an empirical fact. Rather, it is the extra assumption in the explanatory model of the non-idealist positions. When we apply Occam's razor, then since idealism doesn't require this additional assumption, then idealism has a simpler explanatory model and therefore should be preferred over alternative ontologies. So conclusion, in terms of theoretic virtues, the non-idealist views have a higher cost since they add the abstraction of matter. Idealism has an advantage over the alternative ontologies by being simpler and still retaining its explanatory and predictive power. Thus, idealism is the best ontological and metaphysical view of the mind and reality. So when you combine this with the sort of epistemic foundations argument, as well as the causal closure argument that I brought up earlier, we can see the many advantages that idealism has over physicalism and why we should all prefer idealism. And so that will be it for me.
All right. Thank you so much. All right, Thomas, you're up for your 10-minute opening. Let me restart your timer, and I will let you know when to go. All right, you got it, Thomas.
Yeah, am I good to go?
Yep, you got it.
Okay, so my argument for physicalism and realism would be that it's the only view, at least out of these two views, maybe there's a view other than it, but out of these two views that are being debated today, it's the only one that you can get off of the ground. It's the only one that makes logical sense. It's the only one that's possible. Now, there are several problems with idealism, like, for example, where exactly is everything mental being processed? There'd have to be something physical, something real, something material, something non-mental processing all of our thoughts, our intentions, our desires, and so forth. Idealism cannot even give us a definition of what a mind is, right? They'll say that everything is mental, but what does it mean for something to be mental, right? They can't provide a definition of what the mental even is. And related to this problem is that what does it mean for something even to exist? I can provide a definition of existence, but they can't even do that. I can tell you that existence is an object with a shape and a location, a discrete physical object with shape and location. Another problem with idealism is that we never see the seeing, we never see the consciousness. We only ever experience things, we only ever experience objects. We can't take ourselves outside of ourselves to experience the experiencing. Another problem with it is the problem of other minds. How does idealism not devolve into solipsism? If everything is mental, how do you know anybody else's minds exist? How do you know the minds of anyone else exists if everything is mental? Because for all you know, their minds could just be something your own mind is creating, right? So how can you ever know that two people experience the same phenomena, right? How can two people ever see the same object, experience the same event, or whatever? How do two people experience the same phenomena? And another problem with idealism is how can there be ideas? How can there be intentionality? How can there be ideas about things in the world unless there is a world to represent? How can you have mental representations unless there is something other than the mental to represent? And another argument I would give for physicalism and realism would be that if we adopted the idealist view, skepticism becomes inevitable. Another problem is that you'd have to give up the sciences if we were to adopt idealism, because science deals with real material objects. It starts with the assumption that real material objects exist and tries to come up with theories about these real material objects. And so scientific knowledge becomes impossible if idealism is true. Then you end up with a problem of what's called the infinite regress, or the homunculus fallacy, that there's a little man inside your head, but is there a little man inside of that guy's head and a little man inside of that guy's head, right? Idealism will inevitably lead to an infinite regression. See, how much time do I got left here?
You sure about 6.5 minutes.
Okay, well, that's all I really wanted to say. So,
all
if
right.
I should say more, or do you think that was good?
It's up to you. That's your 10 minutes, man. So it's up to you. If you want to continue on, you can. If you want to conclude it there.
I'll conclude it there.
All right. Sounds good. All right, guys. So now we're going to transition to the rebuttal round of this debate. All right. So we're going to transition to the rebuttal. Once again, rebuttal round is 5 minutes. So Kyle, you're up for your 5-minute rebuttal.
And all right. So there's a lot. Sorry about that. Okay. So there's a lot to say on that, and hopefully we get to more in the discussion, because I think this sort of helps clarify what idealism is. So the first thing you pointed out was, of course, you said that it's the only one that can work. Okay, well that's fine. Now you ask, okay, where is the mental being processed, right? Well, in idealism, the mental is fundamental, so there's nothing outside the mental, right? There's nothing that's being processed, right? When you're talking about experience, when you're talking about at least experience simpliciter, there's nothing that would process it, because that is the foundation. Like the foundation of reality is experience, right? So I guess it's just sort of question begging against idealism if you're going to sort of ask that. And then of course, how does idealism? How does idealists define mind? Well, a mind is simply just, a mind is just mental activity in and of itself, right? I guess we can get into more what we mean by mental, but just mental activity. I also sort of make a distinction between consciousness proper and self-effective consciousness. You also ask, what does it mean for things to exist, right? And I would say on the idealist position, things exist in the sense that they are experienced, right? So if it's not being experienced, then it doesn't exist. That's what I would say for the idealist position. Now, of course, you brought up a good point, which is that we never actually see consciousness. And that is true. We don't actually see consciousness because consciousness, it doesn't seem to be a thing in nature. Like it's not like you can point to it, right? Or it's not like you can just use it to sort of, it's not like a physical object. It's something that's intuitively known. Like it's something that's known intuitively, right? And so that's what I would say. Now, you brought up the problem of external mind as well as the problem of external world skepticism. Well, like I said in my opening statement, I think that it's actually the reverse, that idealism actually, that knowledge isn't possible without experience, right? Now, as far as other minds go, I'm happy to admit that, like for example, I think that dream characters are conscious. So, in terms of like dealing with that sort of dilemma, I think that's a good sort of objection, right? But we all have to deal with that problem, right? Every view has to deal with the problem of other minds, regardless if you're an idealist or a physicalist. So I'm not really sure, unless you can sort of demonstrate that idealism faces a bigger problem when it comes to other minds, then I don't really see where it's an issue. And you talked about how can there be ideas? Well, ideas, I would say, are just mental in type, right? So I think that's sort of that problem. And of course, you brought up another good point, which is about skepticism and science and how, you're going to deal with this sort of problem with science. Well, it's weird because I do think I didn't use this in the debate in the opening statement, but there is actually an argument for idealism that argues that we can't actually do science unless idealism is true, right? Because our mental perceptions of the world have to correspond to reality, and that can only work if objective reality is also mental in type. So there is an argument for idealism for that. So I'm happy that you sort of brought that point up because I think it sort of outlines the sort of different views between a sort of subjective idealism versus an objective idealism. And then finally, your last point was about infinite regress of minds, right? And I think that's also a really good point because I do think that I guess this sort of helps clarify again with the idealist position. And so I'm happy to admit that I think that's sort of an issue, like how deep can you go, right? How far does the experience go in your own mind, right? And I think that's a sort of interesting perspective that I'm still working on because I do think that there are sort of like subconscious influences, and the question is, how deep does it go? I don't know, but I think it's a very good sort of way that the idealist could sort of answer that question at least better than alternatives. So, I think most of your opening statement was okay. Of course, I think there's a few points. I think a lot of your points that you made could be sort of clarified a little bit. And of course, other points I think I just have straight disagreements on. But other than that, that's all I got to say on my rebuttal. So.
All right. Thank you, Kyle. All right, Thomas, you're up for your 5-minute rebuttal. Let me restart your time, and then you are off.
Okay, am I good to go?
Hold up. All right, you got it, man.
Okay, so, well, I would first like to respond to the thing about having something to process it. Well, I would say that was mostly just, I guess I was just saying that you would have to need it. Even if you don't have an answer to how you'd solve that problem, I still think you would need to have something to process all the mental stuff. There has to be something powering it. That's all I was really saying there. And then as for, he brought up the mind. I don't think he really adequately answered my question of what even is the mental. I can say that the mental is a series, maybe I could say it's a series of specialized processes in the brain. And I don't. He never really gave a real definition there, and I consider that to be a big problem with the system. Then he also brought up the point about the empirical sciences that I brought up as well. I don't believe the empirical sciences would support idealism. And I would say that the only non-circular definition of truth we have, which is to say the correspondence theory of truth, which is a hotly debated subject, but it is the best theory of truth if you want to deal with the empirical sciences. In order to have that, you have to have a real world which things correspond to. There has to be a world that exists independent of our mental representations of the world. So I would say that the correspondence theory of truth, which I believe is required for the empirical sciences, would not be possible under an idealist system. See here. I guess that's all I really have to say for right now, because I don't really remember what were some of his other objections.
All right, sounds good. Sounds just fine, just fine. All right, guys. So now we're going to transition to our rebuttal round. Our cross-examination round, which will once again be 15 minutes. The first 30 minutes to be 15 minutes each to ask questions, then the final 20 minutes to be open discussion. All right. So everyone out there watching, make sure you get your questions in. If you hear anything that triggers the mind, make sure that you are getting those questions in real fast. So with that said, Kyle, you are up for your 15-minute cross-examination of Thomas.
Okay, so I have about only 9 questions to ask here, and then we'll sort of switch. So the first question I have for you is, what is your definition of consciousness?
Well, I would say I don't have a definition, because I think that is something we just don't know enough about. If I had a definition, right, I would write a scientific paper and try to get like a Nobel Prize or something. That's basically how I see that issue.
Okay. And then the second question is...
I guess, well, let me rephrase it. I guess in a basic sense, consciousness would be our first person experiences, right? If you just want a basic definition, I could tell you that. But I guess I was just making a bit of a mistake there. I was just saying I don't know how it works, I guess I'm trying to say.
So the nature of consciousness, you don't know. Is that
I could say that I could say that consciousness is first person subjective experiences. That's what I could say it is, but I don't know how that works, what powers it, what's the exact set of processes. And if I did, like I said, I would try to get a Nobel Prize for that.
Yeah. All right. So the next question is, as a physicalist, how do you deal with the hard problem of consciousness? Given at least your theory of consciousness, how do you sort of answer that sort of objection?
That's an interesting question. I mean, there's been several ways of dealing with it. David Papanou, I think he has the best way. He came up with this idea of phenomenal concepts, that whenever we see things like color or taste or smell things, right, we're sort of instantiating phenomenal concepts. So that's probably the best answer we have. But again, I see my answer would still be similar in this regard. I still think consciousness is basically a mystery. So, but we do have a few possible ideas of how to deal with something like that.
Okay, I guess just a quick follow-up on that. So you admit that, at least on your view, you don't... Do you admit that physicalism doesn't have the same amount of explanatory power as like some sort of idealism would?
I don't think either has explanatory power. Like, I think it's something we don't have great access to, because, like I said, consciousness is first person, it's subjective. So unless you could cut open like every human being or every animal or whatever, it seems like it would be something that would be very hard to access. I'm not saying we'll never know about it. I think we will eventually, but it's something that's very particularly difficult. It's very, very difficult in a way that other parts of science are not. So I don't think any other, I think my system lacks explanatory power there, but I think other systems lack it as well.
All right. Well, I happen to disagree on that one, but I guess we can get into that discussion, which goes to my next question, which is, how do you justify this idea of a mind-independent reality, like a reality that's totally outside experience? How do you sort of justify that belief?
Well, my justification for it would be that you would need it to really have knowledge of anything. I mean, I would make a transcendental argument for physical reality, if you will, since people like to make those kinds of arguments these days. That would be basically my argument for it, is that you need it for a whole bunch of things to make sense or to be possible. And we could go into that later, but that's basically what my reasoning for it would be.
Yeah, because I mean, my perspective is I think it's the opposite. I think only experience could give us knowledge, right? That in order to make any conclusion at all, we need to make that sort of all of the sort of propositions we make, all the knowledge claims we make, all are all reference to a mental ontology, right? So
okay,
that's what I would say. And then I guess this goes to the next question. So the next question is, now let's just assume the hard problem doesn't exist. Okay, let's just say, okay, it's been solved. Whatever.
Wait. Could you repeat yourself? It kind of cut off at the first part.
Okay, sorry. So let's just assume that the hard problem isn't a problem for your view. And so I guess if that's not the issue, if there's no in principle issue, there's another sort of issue, which goes to my next question, which is, what sort of predictions does physicalism make? Like, within the physicalist picture of reality, why should that reality produce experience at all?
Could you clarify your question a bit? It's a bit hard for me to get.
Yeah, so within your theory of how, what the nature of reality is, like everything's physical, well, how does a physical reality, how is that going to predict there to be experience? Like, predict there to be minds like us, or just any experience at all? Like, how does your theory sort of account for that?
Well, that's a good question. I would say physicalism can account for the mind by, well, I would say the mind, in my theory, I said originally it's a series of processes. If we had sufficient enough science, we could maybe find out what those processes are, what those processes do. But that would be how we would account for the mind. That would be the best way I think we could. There's other ways. Sometimes they'll say it's a property. I don't really like saying it's a property because they don't define what that is. Yeah, but I would say it's a series of processes. You have a computer, right? It has hardware and it has software. And, some people have called this idea functionalism. I wouldn't necessarily hold to what all those people held to, but I think that analogy of the computer, I think, would actually be a good analogy for how a physicalist could understand what the mind is. The brain being like the hardware, and what's the word for it? And the mental states being like the software.
No, right. So if you're I guess this sort of helps clarify. So if you're saying that that's the case, how is that predicted? Why should that occur? Right. Like, doesn't it seem like it's more likely that that at least my hypothesis can sort of predict, while your hypothesis wouldn't predict that sort of thing?
What is it? What wouldn't it predict exactly?
Well, okay. So on my hypothesis predicts that there is going to be conscious minds, right? Because consciousness is foundational. Your hypothesis doesn't seem to do the same thing, because you're not, on your hypothesis, there's a world beyond consciousness, right? So, and if you have this sort of prediction problem, it seems like you sort of have this like prediction problem on physicalism, where there's nothing within the hypothesis that predicts there to be conscious minds. That's what I'm saying. And so I'm asking, like, how do you, like, what would physicalism predict in terms of explaining minds?
Well, I would say that it could predict minds because there would be living entities, and the only way you can have something that's living is it would have to be conscious. But I would have to admit this might be a question that's a bit more complex, right? It might be outside of my scope of knowledge. That to me seems like a very highly scientific question, and I'm not sure I'd be able to answer it fully.
Okay. So I guess the next question is, what do you consider to be the best evidence or argument for physicalism?
The best argument for physicalism? That's a good question. Because my argument for this would be directed against someone who maybe believes in like a soul or something like that, and you don't. So there's that to consider. But I would say the sciences would probably be the best argument for it, because for the most part they assume a form of materialism. Some scientists don't believe in it, but the vast majority of them do believe in it. And it seems to me that their science can't really work unless some version of materialism is true, unless there's some sort of materialist view of reality. Like if you believe in any of the modern science at all, I even saw, like, it was from this book. I don't remember the book, but the guy who wrote it said that you couldn't have a soul if evolution were true. Now I don't necessarily believe in evolution, right? And I know a lot of people don't, but I'm just saying I think the empirical sciences, I do believe that would be the best argument for physicalism. And
Okay.
And I think science has been unable to show us any sort of mental substance or any sort of mental ontology. I think it's been unable to show us that, and I think that would be a great argument for physicalism.
Okay. And I guess last question I'm going to skip, because I think this is probably the more important question. What does physical mean to you? Like, what does it mean for something to be physical?
Well, it would be made of matter, or I defined existence as a discrete object, a discrete physical object with a location. So basically, it would be something that has some sort of dimension, property,
right?
Like it would have to have some category of existence that human beings can understand. That's always been my argument against God's transcendence, is that if he were transcendent, then we couldn't know about him, because he would be outside of all human categories. So it has to be something you can put into some sort of category, like something like this, for example. You could put this into like a set of human categories. So it has to have shape, dimension, location. Now there's different theories about what exactly comprises the universe. Like there were debates in ancient Greece about atomism versus other theories. And again, those would be scientific questions, which I don't necessarily have a lot of knowledge of, but there would have to be some sort of like quality. There could be things that are invisible, but if you were to make them visible, they would have to have something like shape or dimension.
So phenomenal qualities.
Yes.
Okay, I think that's really good, because I would actually agree with that. And I think we can't go into it now, but in our discussion, I want to sort of discuss that more, because I think that sort of highlights one of the biggest reasons why I'm an idealist. Again, we'll get into it more, but yeah, I think I guess for the discussion, we can get into that later. But I guess I could switch off now to your side of the cross-examination.
All right, Christian, you're up for your 15 minutes cross-examination of Kyle.
Okay, fantastic. Trying to think here. So, yeah, I guess I would go back to what I originally said. Would you think that is the mind something ontological to you, or is it a process? What is the mind in your system? Because you think everything is mental. Well, hold on. You think everything is mental, right? So I think we need to have some understanding of what mental is in order for your system to even get off the ground.
It's weird, because your definition of physical seems to be my definition of mental, right? Where everything's just kind of made of these phenomenal properties, like colors, shapes, sounds, smells, right? These sort of phenomenal properties that we always talk about, like every day in our lives. Like those, to me, your definition of physical seems to match my definition of mental, right? And that's sort of interesting, because this sort of, I think, highlights maybe we can come to some sort of agreement on the nature of reality. Maybe we don't have to hold one view there. Maybe we can come to an agreement, right? Because I think it's sort of important to sort of highlight, like the mental is just experience, right? Like when we experience this world, or when we have just subjective experience of our own thoughts, right? And we don't have, like when you're talking about a physicalist world view, you're not, you have to refer to something that's outside experience, which I don't think it is. So I'll just refer to the mind as anything that's experienced, right? And I also want to, I guess, before we get to the next question, there's a little distinction I like to make between self-reflexive consciousness and consciousness proper. So self-reflexive consciousness is like the conscious knowledge of experience, whereas consciousness proper is more like experience simpliciter. So like, let's say if you get knocked out, or like, let's say if you're dreaming but don't remember what you dreamt, well, you're still having experiences, right? It's just you're not self-reflexively aware of those experiences. So it's sort of, I think that sort of distinction sort of highlights that my view of mental seems to be much broader. So I think that when we talk about mental, we're also talking about a world that we're not always, we don't always know. Like, you know what I mean? So.
Okay. Then that brings me to my next question. If everything is experience, right? Because that's what you seem to understand everything to be. Would that be a correct representation?
Yeah.
Well, if everything is experience, then what is experiencing everything? Right? Like, what is doing the experiencing if everything is just a series of experiences?
Well, there's different idealists that will give different answers to that question. So if you're a subjective idealist, you would say, oh, it's just a subject, right? Whereas if you're sort of an objective idealist, like let's say F.H. Bradley, he lived in the 19th century, what he would say is there's this idea of an absolute experience. So this sort of absolute mind that sort of encompasses everything, all of reality, and that is like experience simpliciter is sort of like the foundation, right? Or at least that is reality, right? And there's a little quote, I'll mention that quote in my closing statement to help clarify. But so that sort of view, I would say that where experience is just everything, right? And that's just taking the sort of broadest definition, because there are some idealists that will sort of give different answers. Like I like to use like a dream analogy. So basically we're all in sort of a dream world, but we're not dreaming in the sense of, it's not like we're sleeping somewhere else, right? It's a dream in the sense of we're experiencing reality. We're just in a reality of pure experience. So that's what I would say.
Okay, that doesn't really seem to answer. That doesn't really seem to answer my question. You're saying that it's just a reality of pure experience, but I'm just asking, like, what's experiencing it? Like who or what is experiencing everything? Because my understanding is to experience something, there has to be like a first person being experiencing things, you know?
Unless so it depends. Something. Yeah. So I think that what's experiencing it are subjects like us. We're experiencing it, right? Because we have subjective experiences. And then there's also, you have God, right? And from God's perspective, because he's the sort of source of experience itself, then he would sort of be like the foundational mind of reality. And like all of reality is just experience, right? And what's experiencing it is us as subjects, conscious minds, conscious agents, right? So I think when you sort of understand that, then I guess on my sort of view, I would say that you have God that's sort of experiencing his own dream. And then you also have, people like us that are in that sort of experiential reality, that are experiencing that reality, right? So that's what I would say. That's what I would say is experiencing the subject.
Okay, then that brings me to my next question. What's a subject in your view?
So a subject, again, going back to my distinction between self-reflexive consciousness and consciousness proper. So a subject is somebody, or let's just call it something that has knowledge of experience, right? So us, like we have knowledge of our own experiences. I know that I'm breathing. I know that I'm thinking right now, that sort of thing. So I'm a subject in the sense that I know about my experiences. However, sometimes we don't always know about our experiences, right? So you have to sometimes subjects like us don't always know about our own experiences, right? And then of course you have people like Donald Hoffman, which will argue that since the world is comprised of conscious agents, his sort of view of agents or of a subject would basically be just this sort of, he has this, I can't show it right now, but he has this sort of diagram where you have experience, the world, and an action, and then those sort of affect each other. And that would be what he calls a conscious agent, and that's a sort of subject, right? Now, I do think that there are sort of combinations of subjects, or perhaps a hierarchy of subjects. So I think there's a lot to explore there, but I would say a subject is anything that sort of is just basically a conscious agent, right? So anything that's just having experiences, like we, like us, like we know, we are subjects because we know at least we know for absolute certainty that we are conscious. So, yeah.
Okay. Then this brings me to my next question, and this will be my last one, and I'm not sure how much time there is exactly, but this will just be my last question. I think a version of what you believe in could be possible, but it seems to me anyways that if you had idealism, there would have to be like an actual physical world where all the subjects, right, are wearing VR helmets basically. And that's the reality that they live in and experience. I think something like that is possible, but I don't see how you could have like some sort of mental reality unless there's some sort of physical reality to power it. So I guess that's my question. How do you have a mental reality without some sort of physical reality to power it? I guess that would be my question.
Right. And so I would say that, again, this sort of goes back to the whole framework of idealism itself, where experience is fundamental. Like the mental is the fundamental nature of reality. So if it's the sort of foundation of reality, then there's nothing else that it depends on. It's independent in that sense, right? So let's just take God. Like God, I would say, is the foundation of reality. So there's nothing that God depends on. It's just himself, right? Because he's a mind in that case. So I would say that's just how it works, where consciousness is irreducible, meaning you can't reduce it to something else. Not only that, but it's not really dependent on anything else. Now, I do admit that like our consciousness, our experiences, I think we could be dependent on something deeper, like perhaps God. That's what I think. I think that we as human beings, our experiences depend on God, right? So there can be a sort of like a hierarchy where like sometimes like some subjects will depend on other subjects, but when we're talking more broadly, like when we're talking about the foundation of reality, and the foundation of reality is a mind, it's God. So because God is a mind and because God is, just pure experience, then there's nothing else that sort of, at least ontologically speaking, there's nothing that experience would actually depend on, right? So that's what I would say. And I think the reason why that is, I think that if you're going to try to say that experience depends on something else, you're going to run into a lot of problems. You're going to run into the hard problem of consciousness. If you're going to go a panpsychism route, you're going to run into the combination problem. There's a lot of like metaphysical problems if you're going to try to say that experience can be reduced or perhaps is dependent on something else. I just don't see it happening. So I think the best route to go is just to say that it's irreducible and that, doesn't really depend on anything. So that's what I would say.
Okay, those are my last questions. So the moderator can move on.
All right. So now we're going to transition to more of an open discussion. And so I guess I have a question. So Thomas, you don't believe there is a soul. You don't believe in a soul.
Correct. I don't believe there's sufficient evidence for it. If evidence did exist, I would believe in it, though.
All right. So Kyle, do you believe in a soul?
Yeah, I do. But okay. I think, yeah, I do. That's all I gotta say.
Explain to me how you believe in a soul, and what is a soul in your view?
Yeah. So a soul, in my view, would be just basically someone's personality. So it'd basically be like someone's self-reflexive consciousness, like your personality, your thoughts, your desires, that sort of thing. So I guess a soul would just basically be a subject, on my view. So. Yeah.
Okay, I'm here learning, so I'm hearing all this, and I'm like I'm like, all right, I'm gonna have to ask these guys these questions, man, see what's going on here. So Thomas. Okay, so everything I do, I try to go from a biblical perspective, right? A biblical perspective first, right? And then I expand my theology or whatever philosophy from the biblical text first, right? So I guess I'm trying to figure out, okay, so for Thomas, you say there's no soul. How do you equate that biblically that there is no soul?
Okay, well, I think I wouldn't have enough time to go into every single relevant Bible verse, but I would point to several Old Testament Bible verses where it talks about how, when men die, they perish, their thoughts are no more. There's all sorts of verses in the Old Testament like that. There's also verses that say that, men die like animals, and that our fate is like the animals. And I would also point out that modern scholarship has shown that Jewish people didn't originally believe in a soul until around the time of the Babylonian exile, I believe. So they actually, the original Jewish faith, the one before the influence of the Babylonians, the original one, from what I understand, didn't have the concept of a soul. So that would be my biblical justification for it. It would primarily be the Old Testament. And I would also say there are some Christian physicalists out there who I think do a really good job of the relevant New Testament verses. So that would be my if we're talking about the Bible, that's how I'd go about it biblically speaking.
Okay. All right. So Kyle, pretty much the same question for you. From the biblical text, how would you equate idealism being the proper way to interpret reality? Well, how would you? Go ahead.
Yeah, so I think the soul, especially during Paul's time, was more reference to like someone's like personality, their thoughts, that sort of thing. And I do accept that there are subjects, right? And I also do think that the soul is largely irreducible, although I do think that like if you were to damage the brain, you would damage the soul in that sense. So I think like someone's self-reflexive consciousness.
Okay, hold on right there, Kyle. You said that if you damage the brain, you would damage the soul itself. How? Okay.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, so let's go Bible basics here, right? Let's go Bible basics. All right. So do you believe in hell? You believe in hell?
Yeah, I do.
Okay, so we talk about hell. What goes to hell? Does a soul go to hell, or what goes to hell? Or do your mind, or because I have a hard time because you just said that if the brain is damaged, the soul is damaged too, or the spirit is damaged too.
Yeah,
so
but it's not destroyed. It's not destroyed. There's a sort of difference there because I do think that like if you were to get shot or like if you were to die, right?
Okay.
I think your personality would largely still kind of transfer to hell, but because we got to understand that I'm a monist, right? So I think that all physical objects are mental in type. So of course, if you hit me with a bat or something like that, it's gonna hurt me, right? It's gonna hurt my mental states because you're crossing the sort of like Bernardo Kashup calls it a sort of disassociated boundary where you're hitting my sort of alter my boundary, and it'll affect my mental life because the bat itself is also mental, kind of like how our thoughts will affect our emotions and so on and so forth. Right, it's the sort of everything. There's sort of a cause and effect relationship that goes on in nature, right? So I do think that it sort of affects the soul, but it doesn't destroy it. I think because I do think that consciousness is more fundamental than that. So
okay, I may have some.
Yeah,
I may have a problem with that, man. All right, so and mind you, this is not just me asking you guys questions. So Thomas, if you hear something that Kyle says, you say, hold on, don't hesitate to jump in here. Because I think that's because when I think about it, I'm sort of just trying to grasp what I think I understand about this subject. You know what I mean? Because I think. I sort of lean like with Eric Hernandez as far as the dualist type of position, you know what I mean? So I'm trying to grasp what's going on here. So the brain, okay, so you guys make no separation between the brain and the soul. So Kyle, idealism, you're saying like the brain or your consciousness is your personality. That's
your self-reflexive consciousness, yeah. But then consciousness proper is experience simpliciter, which that happens even if we're not aware of anything. Okay, so that's more. I think that sort of consciousness you can't destroy that part because that's fundamental, right? And so when we're talking about self-reflexiveness, we're talking about like metacognition, right? Like when you think about, for example, when you're thinking about your own thinking, or you're thinking about that sort of thing, like, or you're thinking about your own experiences, like those are metacognition. So I think you could affect that, right? But you can't affect you can't affect the experience itself, because I think the experience is sort of more fundamental.
Okay, so Thomas, what do you think about that? What do you think about what Kyle just said? If you
going to hell, or what exactly?
Yeah, what he just said. As far as their, I forgot what you said now, man. Did you catch what he said, Thomas? Were you?
It was a bit confusing. I kind of lost track there. So.
Yeah, I think I lost track as well, man. You know, so I'm trying to.
It wasn't really clear It wasn't really clear to me what he was saying, so I can't really respond to it.
All right, so let me ask you this then, Thomas. Let me ask you this: do you believe there is a hell? Do you believe there's a hell?
Yeah, I do. I don't necessarily think it's eternal per se, but I do think like there will be some place on Earth where evil people will go, and they will burn there for a period of time, maybe receive other sorts of punishments. So,
all right, so
I believe it'll be proportional to the amount of sinning they did.
All right, so when somebody, so if we're biblically consistent, right? We believe, if we're biblically consistent, we're going to say that there will be a second resurrection, right? A resurrection of the dead, right? Where
right. I believe
there will be
Jesus comes back, and then there'll be the wicked and the righteous there. That's what I believe.
Right, there'll be a physical resurrection where your body is what is the body reunited with in that resurrection?
That's a good question. I believe God would find like I think various parts of the human body can last a really long time, like bones can, for example. So God would find the pieces of you that have lasted the longest, that are the most durable, and then use that as the basis for reconstructing you.
Thomas,
there's other
things. Thomas.
Okay.
Thomas, come on now. So you're telling me that God is going to find body parts that are the more durable, the bones, and use that as the building pieces for your resurrected body, for your glorified body.
Right.
Is that what you're telling me?
Well, that isn't the only possibility. There's also like I can't remember what it was, but there was this thing where we had these sort of cells that were really hard to destroy or something, like these blood cells that you couldn't really destroy. Some people have also proposed doing that, but it would be some part of your body that would be very durable and wouldn't degrade as easily. And then God would take that and remove all the flaws from it, basically. I'm not sure exactly how God will do that, but he would take what he can find of you and remove all the flaws of it and clean it up, basically.
Okay, so the problem I have with that is that, so a person dies before the resurrection, right? We've all had family members that passed away. We've all had family members that are believers who passed away, and our fundamental understanding is that they go to heaven, right? What goes to heaven from a physicalist position?
Okay, well, I'll clarify.
What goes to heaven before that second resurrection? What goes to heaven?
Okay, no, I can respond to that. I would have to say that I don't think, I don't think I don't think there's some sort of intermediate state. So I wouldn't hold to that idea of an intermediate state. So I think basically when you die, you sleep until you either end up on the new heaven, new earth, or you end up in hell. So basically, until that time, I think both the wicked and the righteous would be sleeping.
All right, we got major problems with that, man. That's another debate, though. That's another debate.
Okay. I'm just explaining to you how in my physical system something like that might work.
Yeah, for sure. So Kyle, how would you respond to what Thomas just said? What would be your response, in particular, biblically speaking, from the idea that God is going to put this body back together with parts that are lasting the longest? What would be your response to that from your position?
Yeah, is it as a criticism of his position or just what my position would be?
Either, well, I want to know, what would your position be on that, and what would be a response to? You can start with the response first, and then give me what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah. So I guess that's the only way you could really do it as a physicalist. You would have to deny intermediate state, right? Because once you start admitting that the at least the mind can exist without the body, or at least exist beyond death, then yeah, you're not a physicalist anymore at that point. So I think at least he's consistent, right? Because I think that's a sort of consistent view. Of course, I don't agree with it. I think there is an intermediate state. I think that, I guess now to state my position, I think that when we die, we're going to have this sort of psychedelic experience, or not the sort of drug type, but where basically your consciousness sort of expands and you're sort of like reintegrated with your like memories that you forgot or something like that. It's where you're letting go of, like, you're no longer limited, right? Like your consciousness or your sort of pure experience just kind of sort of expands and becomes, kind of one with everything else. That's because if all of reality is mental, then of course that sort of things needs to happen. And I think it's consistent with like near-death experience reports. I mean, you have that sort of thing happen a lot, where like when people die, they have like this sense of oneness with nature, with the universe. And I think it's very consistent, at least with my view. That's all I gotta say on that. But I mean, at least he's consistent. At least he's consistent. That's all I gotta say. Of course, I don't agree with it, but that's another debate. So
yeah, that's interesting. That's a very interesting position. So I guess that's going to conclude this portion of the debate. It was more, and like I said, I'm trying to learn. I'm trying to grasp this stuff. That's why I had to ask those questions. So thank you guys. All right, so now we're going to transition. You have something to say, Thomas?
I was going to say, can we make the next part of the debate relatively quick? Because I've been sitting down a long time, and we've been here for a while. That's all I'm saying.
For sure. All right, so the next portion is the closing statements, and then we're going to have a little bit of Q&A coming up. So, Kyle, if you're up for your 5-minute closing, man.
Yeah, so I guess, I thought it was pretty good, this sort of discussion, this debate. I sort of highlighted, I guess we can sort of conclude. I don't remember you ever responding to a lot of the points in my opening statement about how idealism is simpler, because we don't have to posit this world outside consciousness, right? And I guess to close off with the sort of closing arguments to think about idealism, first of all, I do think that that there is an objective world out there, right? That the world is objective. But the issue is we have to remember that on idealism, the objective world is also mental, right? So that there's no sort of distinction between, our own thoughts. At least there's no ontological distinction between our own thoughts and the outside world, that they're both sort of related to each other in that sort of way. And then, of course, I think, when it comes to explanatory power, I do think that physicalism still faces the problems that I mentioned. If it doesn't have, we talk about the hard problem consciousness, that's an in-principle problem. I think it's a problem. But even if that's not a problem, it still has this predictability problem where there's nothing on physicalism on that sort of hypothesis that would predict there to be experience. So in terms of just explanatory power, I think that idealism is just simply the winner. Of course, there's a lot of other objections I could go over. There's a lot of objections to idealism that we could discuss. But if you guys want to sort of see some of those responses, I would recommend people read Bernardo Kastrup, as well as just see my own YouTube video, because I made a whole video playlist of answering objections to idealism. But I don't know. I feel like there needs to be more discussion on this topic. And I guess just two final thoughts. The whole definition of what physical and mental means. So I do think that there can be a sort of agreement in terms of, we agree that when we're talking about reality, we are talking about these things with phenomenal properties. We are talking about a reality of experience. And that's all I'm saying, right? That's all idealism is saying, that all that exists is experience. There's nothing beyond experience. And so I just want to close off with this sort of quote from F.H. Bradley. So this is what he said, and this was one of his most famous statements that he's done. Find any piece of existence, take up anything that anyone could possibly call a fact, or could in any sense assert to have being, then judge if it does not consent in sentient experience. Try to discover any sense in which you can still continue to speak of it, when all perception and feeling have been removed, or point out any figment of its matter, any aspect of its being which is not derived from and is not still relative to the source. When the experiment is made strictly, I can myself conceive of nothing else than the experienced. Anything in no sense felt or perceived becomes to be quite unmeaning, and as I cannot try to think of it without realizing either that I am not thinking at all or that I am thinking of it against my will as being experienced, I am driven to the conclusion that for me, experience is the same as reality. The fact that falls elsewhere seems, in my mind, to be a mere word and a failure, or else at an attempt at a self-contradiction. It is a vicious abstraction whose existence is meaningless nonsense and is therefore not possible. So that quote is from Bradley, and what he's basically saying there is when we talk about reality, we are talking about experience fundamentally. And so I just don't see any reason to deny that fact that reality is experience. And so, once you accept that reality is experience, then you're an idealist. So that's all I got to say on that.
All right. Thank you, Kyle, for the closing statement. All right, Christian. Thomas, sorry. You're up for your closing remarks, man.
Okay, well, since he brought up the Occam's razor issue, I forgot to add that because I didn't capture everything. I didn't capture all of his objections, but I would say that the realist view of the world more fits Occam's razor, and because you don't have all these problems like the ones I mentioned with idealism, and that's how most people intuitively see the world. Most people think the world is physical because they don't really know of anything else out there, and so it's questionable if everything was mental, if we could even know about it. So I would say that if you want knowledge to be possible, if you want to believe in the correspondence theory of truth, if you want to believe in empirical science, if you want to have things that have actual properties, have actual qualities that make them intelligible, like if you want the world to be intelligible, understandable at all, then it makes sense to believe in materialism and realism. And that's how most people see the world. And I think most people see it, not because they're being deluded in some sort of illusion, but because that's what reality is. I don't think there's any good reason to question the realness of reality, which is to say that it isn't just a set of mental ideas. It isn't just a set of experiences, that there is an actual external world out there. And so I would say that is far more simpler than trying to make the world purely mental. So that's all I got to say.
All right. Thank you both. All right. So now we're going to jump into this Q&A. We got some questions for you guys. Not a whole bunch, but we got some. So let's get into this real quick. All right. This is for Kyle. Hold on. See if the overlay is set up right. All right, let me get that question back up. All right, doesn't want to work. Right. World. Hold on, guys. Let me see what's up with this. It's like triggering the wrong thing. All right, so I'm gonna read this question for you real quick. As for Kyle, under idealism, would imaginary things like Santa and the Tooth Fairy exist since we experienced them?
No, because there's a distinction between your subjective experience versus an actual objective sort of absolute. So there, I think we need to understand that, again, I said earlier that there is an objective world out there. Like that world is objective, right? So it's not like when we're talking about experience, of course, experience is subjective, but there's also a sort of objective aspect to it where our perceptions of reality can correspond to that reality, and sometimes they don't. And when they don't, like, we can have hallucinations, we can have our sort of own private experiences, right? And so what I'm saying is that we're just taking the idea of experience and then expanding it, or taking consciousness and expanding it to include everything else. So there is this sort of like objective consciousness or objective experience that exists beyond my mind, right? It's just that there's no ontological distinction. I think there needs to be that sort of important distinction where there is a sort of subjective experience, but then there's also this world of experience where that world is just mental, right? So no, I don't. I mean, obviously, you can hallucinate Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy, but that doesn't mean they actually exist in objective reality. I don't think that's true, because again, there's still an objective world. So, yeah.
All right. Thomas, any thoughts?
No, I don't have any thoughts on that.
All right. And I fixed my little question thing here. All right. So this is for you, Thomas. Are you a reductive, non-reductive physicalist? If the former, how do you solve the hard problem of consciousness? If the latter, how do you solve the exclusion problem?
I would just add, I'm not sure what the exclusion problem is, so I'm not sure I'd be able to answer it. And then I would say, I mean, I'm not sure where I would put my view, but I guess my view would be a reductive form of physicalism, since I don't say that the mind is a property. I'd say it's a series of processes as opposed to being a property. So I guess that's where my view might be closer to that. I'm not exactly sure where you'd put something like that. And then as for the hard problem of consciousness, like I don't think there is a solution yet. Like my answer would be the same to you as I gave to Kyle, which is that I think it's something we don't have access to yet, or something we know enough about yet to really say a lot about. We can only really give a definition of consciousness, which is to say it's a first person subjective experience of the world, but we can't really say anything about it more than that for the various reasons I've said, because it's an epistemologically difficult thing to access.
All right. Any thoughts on that, Kyle?
No.
Y'all making this the quickest debate on the gospel truth, man.
Well, I'm sorry. It's hard. It's hard for me to sit in a chair for more than an hour. So.
All right, you good, man? Let me see.
And I'm not hitting and running like some guy was trying to say. Oh, I'm hitting and running. No, man. It's just like I want to use my legs sometimes. That's all I'm saying.
All right. On idealism, the body is the extrinsic appearance of the
extrinsic,
mind. Yeah, intrinsic appearance of the mind. So it is not predicted that the dead bodies remain around and decompose after the mind is gone. How do you explain this? Kyle, you could crack at that.
How is it not? I don't know, because idealism doesn't say anything about people having because that's sort of interesting, because I do think that when we're talking about extrinsic appearance, right, that just means from a third person perspective, right? Like obviously people can die from a third person perspective. Like when you, let's say, shoot someone and you see them dead, well, obviously they're dead. But I think that's only from an extrinsic perspective. Whereas if you're intrinsic, meaning like if you're talking about the sort of subject themselves that died, from their perspective, they're in a whole different world. Essentially, they're experiencing something completely different than what you actually see, right? I mean, I think that's an interesting, because I do think that life overall is the extrinsic appearance of disassociated alters of consciousness. So I think it's sort of interesting how why do we die? Well, I think it's just a process of nature, but I'm not really sure how it's really an issue for idealism.
All right.
But yeah, I don't know.
Any thoughts on that, Thomas?
I'm good. No thoughts on it.
All right. This is for you, Kyle. Is idealism similar to philosophy in mathematics and I don't know how you pronounce that? Pythagoras?
Pythagoras.
Pythagoras?
Yeah.
Right.
I think he misspelled it. I think it's supposed to have a Y there.
All right.
Yeah.
Pythagoras, when he explained the mind can conjure the perfect square, but or cannot physically create one, like the difference between the perfect and the tangible.
Yeah, if you were to take a sort of, I don't hold this view, but if you were to take a sort of Platonic idealism, you could sort of make that distinction where you have God has the sort of his thoughts are sort of the ideal thoughts versus our thoughts, which are more tangible. Um, I think that's a sort of interesting way to put it, but again, that's only one form. I mean, there's so many different forms of idealism out there that like it's like I'm having like I myself I've invented a few of forms of idealism that like no one holds to just to just to have fun with it, but yeah, that's what I would say.
All right, Thomas, any thoughts?
No.
No thoughts. All right. Pressing forward. Let me see. There's a question for you, Thomas. What is Thomas' argument in favor that there's a reality beyond experience?
Okay. My argument for it would be that we can't experience experiencing. We can't take ourselves outside of our experience then see the experiencing happening. We can only ever see real physical objects, right? I can't see the seeing of this phone I have here. I can only see the phone itself, right? So that would be my main argument, and the transcendental arguments I gave for realism, for the fact that there is a world beyond our representation of the world, that you would have to have something like that for reality to make sense. I believe it's the only coherent view out of these two views. So that would be my arguments.
All right. Kyle, any thoughts?
No thoughts.
All right. And we'll make this the last question of the night. Let me see. We'll make this the last question. Kyle, does Kyle think that the brain is physical and the object that could damage the brain is physical? If not, how could one affect the other?
Yeah, so I think this sort of goes back to our sort of different views of what the physical is. So on idealism, the physical as defined in physicalism doesn't actually exist, right? It's sort of idealism is the denial of a world that is physical in the sense that physical is defined as a world beyond experience. Okay, so in that sense, I would say that the brain is sort of mental itself. Like the brain is the extrinsic appearance of our sort of disassociate or our alter of consciousness, right? And then, of course, when you're talking about a physical object, right? When an object, that object and the brain are ontologically on idealism. They're both the same because the object and the brain are mental. So you have to sort of switch the words. So instead of talking about physical, you have to talk about mental. And once you do that, well, then now you can sort of understand that there is this objective mental world, and that objective mental world is the world of experience. Like when you're talking about, just something's taste, something smells, colors, sounds, all those things that we experience every day are all mental phenomena. And that's all we're saying is like reality is mental phenomena. Reality is experience. And so that's pretty much it. I mean, a physical object, of course, an object, in that case, I mean, I guess if you were to make it more, I'll close it off here. So if you were to make it more formal, you could say that physical objects are the thoughts of universal consciousness. Now, we didn't talk much about this here, but I say that universal consciousness is God. Like that is the sort of absolute experience. So physical objects could be thoughts of universal consciousness, right? That's what I would say. And of course, because it's, the same ontology as our brains, then of course it's going to damage it. So, yeah.
Right. Thomas, any thoughts on that?
No, I think he did pretty good there.
All right, guys. So that concludes this debate. I appreciate you both. So as always, I do send out gifts, just appreciation from me to you for coming on the Gospel Truth and participating in this debate.
I'd also like to say to Kyle, I thank him for being very respectful. I've dealt with a lot of debaters, and oftentimes they're not very respectful people. So I give him credit for that.
Yeah.
Right.
Thanks.
Yeah, you guys were definitely cordial. So I appreciate you guys for Doing that.
Well, and thanks for having us. Like, I know it takes a lot of time to do stuff like this, and thanks to Kyle also for taking time as well. So, I thought this was a very fun and very interesting debate.
Cool. All right. Yeah, I learned a lot from it, and I'm sure the audience was very, as you guys see the live chat, it's very interactive, to say the least. So thank you guys once again for joining me, and I'll be reaching out to you guys after the show to get your addresses to get that gift to you guys. All right. So thank you guys. All right.
Fantastic.
All right, folks. Thank you once again for joining us this episode of the Gospel Truth, man. Another interesting debate. This is new to me. So I'm sure a lot of the guys on there, they, talking all the jive and everything, and that's good stuff because I'm new to it. I'm asking just basic questions, right? I'm asking fundamental questions, and I start with the Bible, man. If the Bible says yes, I say yes. If it say no, I ain't touching it. That's how I roll, man. So it's good stuff, and I thank Kyle and Thomas for coming on. That said, if you're planning on leaving this debate, I mean, you watch this debate, don't leave this channel early. Make sure you subscribe first before you bounce. And so you can stay in the loop with what everything the Gospel Truth has going on, man. Make sure that you are hitting that like, make sure you're hitting that subscribe, make sure you're doing what you do to have to stay in the loop with the Gospel Truth, so you don't miss out anything, man, because I have a whole bunch of shows coming up. Please stay in the loop. A whole bunch of shows. You don't want to miss out on them. You don't want to miss out on them, man. So it's an exciting time with the Gospel Truth, and I thank you guys for joining me, and I'm gonna get out of here. Where's my deal? Like, there it is. So I thank you guys for joining me. I'm gonna get out of here. May God bless you, and may God keep you. I'm gone.